Welcome to the Different Kind of Psychiatry podcast, brought to you by the ACO. I'm Dr. Chris Burrett. Each month, we feature a narrated article, case presentation, or interview or discussion with one or more of our doctors who practice a different kind of psychiatry. We are interested in your questions and comments, and I would love to hear your feedback. Send an email to aco@orgonomy.org. The best way to help the American College of Orgonomy spread its knowledge is by letting others know about us. If you enjoy the podcast, we'd appreciate you leaving a rating and review. If you're interested in attending one of our webinar presentations, you can meet the doctors and join in on the discussion afterwards. If you're interested in training with the ACO, you can learn more about the medical orgone therapy or social orgonomy training programs. You can connect with us and learn more at orgonomy.org. This episode features something completely different. The ACO recently released the audiobook version of Wilhelm Reich and Orgonomy by Dr. Ola Raknes, and we're happy to provide a sneak peek in this podcast episode. If you're interested in listening to any of our other books in audiobook form, reach out and let us know which one we should produce next.
Pitch Perfect Entertainment presents Wilhelm Reich and Orgonomy by Ola Raknes, Ph.D. Read for you by J.D. Roberts. Chapter 2. Psychoanalytic Period. As mentioned already, Wilhelm Reich's earliest scientific interest was in nature, especially in living nature, that is, in biology, and this was an interest organically created by his life on the farm. When, after his participation in World War I, he took to studying medicine, he had two equally strong motives: his wish to help people in trouble and his interest in the origins and development of the phenomena he had to study, as well as the energy behind them. Even before the completion of his MD degree, Reich manifested his interest in the question of psychic energy in an article called The Concepts of Psychic Drives from Forel to Young, a theme to which he returned the year after his degree in a new article, The Energetics of Drives. From his clinical work as well as from counseling and political activity among the Vienna youth, he knew that the drives that caused the greatest practical as well as theoretical difficulties were those that came under the heading sexuality, a theme that was almost as much taboo then, in the early 20s, as it had been when Freud started his work in the last decade of the previous century. This is not the place to give extracts of the articles mentioned or of others published in the following years. We only wish to stress that in all these writings, Reich's interest centered about the same problems that were to lead to all his great discoveries, namely the bioenergetic problems, such as the biological basis of instinctual functioning, the biological nature of pleasure and tension, the role of genitality, the function of the orgasm, and the sources of neurotic anxiety. In this first phase of his activity, Reich worked within the psychoanalytic movement. His discoveries in this period have little by little become a part of the common body of psychoanalytic technique and theory, though often in a truncated and misunderstood form, and still more often without a mention of Reich's part in it. In later years, Reich used to say that the best way for a man to find his own originality is by loyally and conscientiously practicing and trying out what he has learned from others, for he can then uncover the shortcomings and see where supplements and alterations were needed. He maintained that he did this for years with what he had learned from Freud. Reich's first important contribution to psychoanalytic therapy was his elaboration of a consistent technique of resistance analysis. Freud had shown the importance of analyzing the patient's resistance before interpreting the unconscious wishes and memories that were being revealed by the patient's dreams, slips of tongue, and free associations. However, most of the analysts up to Reich's time had, to a great extent, neglected resistance analysis, and not until Reich had shown how to attack and analyze the resistances did this become an integral part of psychoanalytic training and therapy. During his work on resistance analysis, Reich made his first important discovery. He saw that the main resistance to analysis was revealed not by what the patient said or did, but by the manner in which he said or did it. by not the what, but the how, because the manner was expression of the patient's character. Before Reich, others, especially Freud, Abraham, and Jones, had shown how separate character traits had their origins in a fixation at some infantile stage of the libido development, and it was generally accepted that when some drive or instinctual component had developed into a character trait, it had reached the end stage of its history, and there was nothing more to do about it. Reich was the first psychoanalyst to formulate a coherent theory of character. He showed that the different character traits were dependent one upon the other, and that taken together, they formed a unitary defense against all emotions that were felt to be dangerous in one way or the other. This defense Reich called the character armor. Reich was able to show that this armor had its origin in situations in childhood, where the child had been denied satisfaction of some instinctual drive, and that the energy of such a drive had been split up in a way that made one part of it hold the other part in suppression. When Reich, instead of interpreting the material which patients brought him, began to call their attention to the way they brought it and to their general manner of behavior, it was felt by them as an attack upon their personalities and very often as a shock. This provoked their negative feelings towards the analyst and the treatment. I think that all who have gone through a classical Freudian analysis before their character analysis, the present writer being one of them, felt the new therapy as something quite different, something going much deeper, to the very core of their personalities. Reich's experiences with his patients in this respect also convinced him of the necessity of bringing out into the open their hostility or negative sentiments, the so-called negative transference. This earned Reich a reputation of aggressiveness, a reputation that is very alive still, even after his death. Although anybody who is free himself and who has mastered the technique of character analysis must know that the aggression is not a thing that the therapist puts into the patient, but something which, if he is clever and fortunate, he can get out of him. By making the patients feel some of their own characteristics and feel them as something more or less alien to their own personalities, Reich became aware of other facts to which attention had hardly been paid before in psychoanalytic practice or theory. Many patients, when becoming conscious of their characteristics, would spontaneously change their bodily attitude and behavior, and give expression to emotions which since childhood they had never been able to express, and hardly to feel. Reich now began studying changes in bodily attitudes accompanying outbreaks of emotions, and he soon was convinced that to the psychic character armor there corresponds a somatic muscular armor. To some psychotherapists today, this has become a matter of course, but in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when Reich's discovery began to be known, it was met with opposition and ridicule. As late as in the 1940s, after I had reported a case history to a group of psychotherapists of different schools, a Freudian psychoanalyst remarked that what I had reported was not psychology, but kropology, krop being the Norwegian word for body. It soon became clear to Reich that the muscular armor, which consists of spasms, cramps, and tensions, is nothing but the bodily expression of the repressed emotions and ideas, and the somatic anchoring of the neuroses. In psychoanalytic circles, the question had often been raised where the repressed ideas and emotions were located, and the answer was, as a rule, that they were in the unconscious. Now Reich showed that they were bound as well in the muscular armor, in the spasms, holdings, and tensions of which the person had no consciousness or understanding. This discovery led to another innovation in psychotherapeutic technique, namely to attacking the neuroses from the bodily side, partly by calling the patient's attention to the chronic tensions, partly by making him feel them by direct manipulation. By thus loosening up the holdings and tensions, one could bring into consciousness emotions and memories which had hitherto been completely repressed, even if the therapist had succeeded in guessing what they had been from the patient's dreams and associations. Not only repressed emotions and memories came to light, however, but also things that nobody had thought of before, or paid any attention to, and that should prove to be of the utmost importance for therapy as well as for further discoveries. These new and unexpected experiences were feelings of streaming in the patient's body, streamings that to most of the patients were formerly unknown, and which to most of those who knew them had been of little or no significance. Such streamings were pleasurable, usually soft and rather weak, but occasionally so strong that the person felt that they overflowed him. In such latter cases, and sometimes even when they are of moderate strength, they would make the patient afraid as of some unknown danger. These streamings seemed to stem from the vegetative or autonomous nervous system, and Reich therefore called them vegetative streamings. It soon became evident that these streamings appeared only when a considerable loosening of the spasms and tensions had taken place, so that the patient could relax and breathe fairly freely, and they always inaugurated a more general feeling of well-being. They therefore became signs of therapeutic progress, and as such assumed an ever greater importance for the evaluation of what had been attained. But what were they, and what was their function in the total economy of the psychosomatic organism? These were questions that Reich always had in mind, and we shall later return to them and see the solutions which Reich found to them. On the basis of the findings we have just described, Reich elaborated a new therapeutic technique, that of character analysis. In the first years, when working with this new technique, there was still another thing that struck him. When a patient had become conscious of an attitude or manner of behavior, he would often change it, sometimes momentarily, and present a new facade, as it were. When he was made aware of this new attitude, he would change it again for another, or sometimes revert to his former attitude. It was as if the character consisted of interchangeable layers, or as if it were a fortress with several lines of defense, one behind the other. As the therapeutic endeavor, which in its early stages of development might be characterized as pure character analysis, shifted ever more to attacking the muscular armor, this layering of the character came to play a lesser role. The stress was laid more on the changing bodily tensions, the fact that when you had succeeded in loosening one tension, the corresponding emotion would not break through to consciousness or to expression, but would, as it were, seek refuge in a new tension or reactivate some formerly dissolved tension. Working directly on the tensions would eventually liberate the repressed emotional energies, which also manifested themselves in the vegetative streamings. When the new therapeutic technique had reached this stage, Reich termed it character analytic vegetotherapy, or simply vegetotherapy. But analytic work on character always remained an important part of the new technique. Before elaborating the new technique of character analysis and vegetotherapy, which eventually carried him away from psychoanalysis, Reich had made his most important contributions to psychoanalytic theory, contributions that were to fill gaps in Freud's theory of the instincts and of the neuroses, and that were also to earn for Reich the displeasure and even the enmity of many of his colleagues. The first of those contributions was his orgasm theory, the second his demonstration of the social and ideational background of the neuroses. Freud's main work on the theory of the instincts was his book, 3 Contributions to the Theory of Sex, 1905. In this work, Freud set forth the evolution of the sexual drives through all their infantile stages, from the oral through the anal sadistic and phallic to the genital stages, pointing out for each of the 3 earlier stages what consequences a fixation on any of them might have for later development of the individual. Of the genital stage, he did not say much more than that it was the final stage of sexual development, to be reached in puberty, at which period its impulses had to be kept back and sublimated, that is, transformed into some socially acceptable, non-sexual activity, until such time as direct satisfaction of sexual impulses would be recognized as legitimate by society. But Freud never went into the full role or significance of genital sexuality, either in childhood or adulthood. Some of Reich's first contributions to the psychoanalytic journals had for their subject matter genital sexuality and its significance for the therapy of the neuroses. But his main work in this field, which summed up his experience so far and became the basis for his further discoveries, was his book Die Funktion des Orgasmus, Vienna, 1927, not to be confused with his later work in English, The Function of the Orgasm, Part 1 of The Discovery of the Orgone, Orgone Institute Press, New York, 1942. In this work, Reich investigates first the reasons that some cases show little or no results of psychoanalytic therapy, and others that seem to have been cured, either relapse into their old neurosis or produce a new one, while still others retain their regained health. The outcome of Reich's investigation was that the refractory cases, as well as those that relapsed, had at least one thing in common which distinguished them from the successful ones. They had never succeeded in establishing a satisfactory sex life on a genital level. Thus, a satisfactory sex life proved to be a conditio sine qua non of lasting mental health, a conclusion that met with strong opposition from all sides and which is still a scandal to all who have neither a knowledge of deep psychotherapy nor themselves a satisfactory sex life. The next question which Reich investigated in Die Funktion des Orgasmus was, what is a satisfactory sex life? A question that, to my knowledge, had never until then been the object of scientific research. Reich's answer, based upon his own therapeutic experience as well as on information gathered from healthy or relatively healthy persons, was that a healthy sex life depends on a complete, convulsive discharge of sexual energy in the embrace of a beloved partner of the opposite sex, with momentary loss of consciousness. The capacity for such an experience Reich termed orgastic potency, which thus became a criterion of mental health. The orgasm, as Reich described and defined it, thus stood out as the fulfillment of healthy adult sex life. The third and last central question that Reich explored in this book was the one indicated by its title, the question of the function of the orgasm in the total psychosomatic organism. Until now, the function of sexuality had been regarded almost exclusively as that of the maintenance and propagation of the species. Whatever other aspects there were to it, its longings, its drives, its promises of pleasure and bliss, were regarded as lures that nature had set up for man in order to make him take upon himself the cares, the pain, and the work of bringing up progeny. Now Reich, without denying this function of sexuality, showed that this function was not the only one, perhaps not even the primary or the most important one. This other function, which manifests itself without any thought of procreation, even long before the possibility of procreation, is the regulation of the bioenergy by the discharge of that part of the energy that is not consumed in the other activities of the human being. Another aspect of this function is that it furnishes the well-being and the pleasure that make life enjoyable and worth living. In order to ensure the optimal functioning of the life apparatus, the discharge of dammed-up energy has to be complete, that is, orgastic. If not, the residual or bound energy will hamper the free functioning of the organism in its thinking, its emotions, and its actions, and it may also even pervert them to life-inimical purposes. It is such residual energy that feeds the secondary drives that play such an important role in the neuroses. It is true that sexuality without orgasm may serve the function of procreation in a seemingly satisfactory way, but only orgastic genitality can fulfill in an optimal way that other function of sexuality, the regulation of organismic bioenergy. Orgastic potency thus safeguards, as far as that is possible in a sex-inimical society, the healthy functioning of the human organism in rational thinking, in natural emotionality, in purposeful action. No wonder that Reich should consider it the chief and central aim of therapy. True, at times he stressed this aim in a way that made it difficult for the patient to approach it. That is, he made the patient feel so strongly his own insufficiency that he became unable to accept himself as the imperfect being he was, and to make the most out of what he was, and thus to approach the ideal goal in the only way possible. However, only few, if any, who pass through the mill of our education and society will ever attain this goal completely. Another question, which from the very beginning occupied Reich's mind, was how the general destruction of natural living functioning could be prevented. In our civilization, as in most other higher civilizations, it is the adults, that is, the more or less twisted characters, who set the goals for the education, that is, the formation, of children and adolescents, and in general, it must be said that they set the goals so as to serve their own convenience and to perpetuate their own prejudices. Only some rather primitive peoples, such as the Eskimos, take quite a different view of education and of the upbringing of children. According to the ancient religion of the Eskimos, an aspect which Christianity has only partly succeeded in destroying, the child is the wisest of all, and therefore the worst misdeed a man can do is to thwart a child. To the Eskimos, this is not just a theoretical or theological belief, but they act according to it, to the amazement of all civilized observers. I do not know whether or not Reich knew much of the Eskimos. It is possible that he did, for he had extensive ethnological knowledge, but he was among the first in our civilization to propagate similar principles to those of the Eskimos, and to show a way of practicing them, at least to some extent, even in our society. He set up as the leading principle for the upbringing of children what he called self-regulation. By that he meant that the children should be given the opportunity to have all their natural or primary drives satisfied in their own way. There would then be no secondary perverted drives. It was a constant concern of Reich's to find out how, in our civilization, it could be possible to apply this principle of self-regulation. One of the difficulties was that the parents who heard of it and theoretically accepted it very often had so little feeling for the child that they thought it sufficient to let him do just what he liked, thus neglecting those needs of the child which he could not himself give expression to. Frequently, they would also mistake license, that is, the letting loose of secondary drives, for freedom, and thus let develop in the child a lack of regard for others. A reviewer, Norman M. Levy, M.D., Journal of Orgonomy, Volume 4, November 1970, has pointed out that the concept of self-regulation should be defined more clearly, and his classification, with which the author fully agrees, reads as follows. The concept of self-regulation means allowing the child full expression of his basic energetic pleasure functions, oral, genital, motoric, exploratory, while at the same time teaching him to respect the rights of others and to have concern for his own safety. The biological pleasure drives are concerned solely with gratification, so that the infant initially has little awareness of others' needs. This must be provided by the environment. The task of parents, so difficult in our society, is to educate the child to an acceptance of limits on behavior without interfering with his capacity to experience pleasure. Such training, which includes being allowed to experience frustration, is an important need not expressed directly by the child. In a patriarchal authoritarian system, upbringing of children means crushing the life out of them. Modern, licentious upbringing means distorting children's perception of the world by telling them anything goes. Both extremes are life negative. It soon became evident to Reich that if the formation of neuroses should be prevented and natural, rational living be established, it would be necessary to change the prevailing ideologies in our society, whether or not they proclaim to have a religious, moral, or a philosophical basis. He showed that the suppression of natural instinctual drives and their conversion into secondary drives, mostly sadistic or masochistic, had its roots in such ideologies and the perverted instincts of the suppressors. For some time he thought that the necessary changes could be brought about by political action, and therefore was very active in the educational work of the progressive political parties. He became a member in Austria of the Socialist Party and in Germany of the Communist Party, and took an active part in their work. However, in a few years, he became convinced that radical politicians, the communists especially, were no longer fighters for personal freedom and natural living. When he tried to show the party members the real causes of human suppression and misery, he was excluded from the party. He later came to speak of the communists as red fascists. Within the psychoanalytic movement, Reich had tried for years to arouse the interest of his colleagues in the social and ideational background of the neuroses, and to make them feel it was their duty to take up active work for prophylaxis. By a majority of his colleagues, this was felt as an intrusion into and a disturbance of their peaceful occupation. And when National Socialism came into power with Hitler, a threat to their very existence. In 1934, therefore, he was excluded from the International Psychoanalytic Society. After that, he had a thorough distrust of organizations. When later he found it necessary for the support of his work to create new organizations, he took good, perhaps excessive, care that he should not be bound or hampered by them. And he never again took part in party politics. Reich's occupation with politics also made him apply his psychological findings to this field of human activity. In his Mass Psychology of Fascism, he showed how neurotic characters with suppressed instincts and perverted drives must of necessity carry their irrationalism into their public and political activity too. He showed how the natural longing for contact and happiness had been perverted into mutual dependence between the political leaders and their followers, how competition, distrust, and craving for power took the place of natural collaboration and mutual satisfaction. And he showed how all this was a logical result of anti-sexual authoritarian upbringing of the younger generation. In his therapeutic work, which formed the starting point for his various branches of research, and which he continued beside his research work till after 1950, Reich constantly made new observations and discoveries, which were partly confirmations of earlier hypotheses and partly showed the way to further elaborations. Working on the character armor as well as on the muscular armor in order to release the suppressed organismic energies and establish orgastic potency, he had long noticed that when chronic spasms and tensions were dissolved, spontaneous movements would appear. Movements of quite another order than those which were formerly present, either as more or less stiff and clumsy voluntary movements, or as jerky mechanical ones. The new movements were soft, harmonious, and graceful, and when left to develop, showed a tendency towards an even and natural rhythm of unification of the whole body. The rhythm was that of the breathing, and now Reich discovered that if under certain conditions, which we cannot go into here, the breathing rhythm was left to accelerate spontaneously, it would encompass the whole body and end in a reflex convulsion. This was the discovery of the orgasm reflex. Even before this discovery, during his work on the function of the orgasm and what he termed the vegetative streamings in the body, Reich had tried to formulate from the point of energy what happened in the orgasm. His description of this process he finally formulated thus: mechanical tension to bioelectric charge to bioelectric discharge to relaxation. This description he at first called the orgasm formula, later the formula of biological tension and charge. As is seen from the formula itself, Reich at first thought that the energy in question was a specific kind of electricity, bioelectricity. As we shall see, he later came to another opinion. In the same epoch as those discoveries, Reich had been impressed by the antithetical nature of two basic phenomena met with in the treatment of every neurosis: sexuality and anxiety, which he termed the fundamental antithesis of vegetative life. At this time, he still thought that the energy expressed in the vital phenomena was a kind of electricity. In order to test this hypothesis, he executed a series of experiments in 1934 to 36, some in the Institute of Psychology of the University of Oslo, to show whether an oscillometer would register any variation in the skin's electrical potential when the skin was touched in a way that provoked pleasure, or pleasurable sexual excitement, or anxiety. The experiments showed that the skin potential rose with pleasurable feelings and fell with anxiety. They thus showed that the antithesis pleasure-anxiety has a biological or biophysical basis, but the variations were so slight that they could not account for the experienced energies in the human emotions. Those energies still needed an explanation. A major part of Reich's later work was concentrated upon the elucidation of the energy question. Chapter 3. Bions and Biogenesis. After the discovery of the orgasm formula and the orgasm reflex, it struck Reich that the orgastic movements of the human body had a very great likeness to, or might even be identical with, those of the protozoa as seen under the microscope. This made him ask himself if the orgasm function were a common function of all living matter, and if the orgasm formula might be the common formula for life functioning. As always in Reich's research, he looked to observations and experiments for confirmation or refutation of this idea. If the orgasm formula was the life formula, it might also give a clue to the problem of biogenesis, which had occupied Reich's mind from his early student days. He had read and heard biologists and philosophers say that there must be some transition from lifeless to living matter, although they were unable to prove it. Most biologists, however, thought that Pasteur had proved once and for all that life could come only from some other living organism, never from lifeless matter. Reich now began 2 series of experiments, both with the object of arranging non-living matter in such a manner that processes were set going that spontaneously would produce a rhythmical 4-beat tension, to charge, to discharge, to relaxation, as in the orgasm. In one series of the experiments, he would take organic material, as dry moss or dry grass, sterilize it by high temperature, and then let it swell in sterilized water. It was then shown under the microscope that from the grass or moss, small vesicles would detach themselves, vesicles that would contract and expand in a way recalling the movements of the protozoa. After some time, even more of those vesicles would gather into heaps, which eventually would surround themselves with membranes and start moving like monocellular animals, that is, protozoa. In the other series, Reich would take inorganic or lifeless substances, such as coal dust, fine sand, or metal dust or rust, heat them into incandescence in a gas flame, and while they were still aglow, put them into a sterile nutritive solution. In the solution, some of the particles would swell into vesicles that would start to move as the vesicles of organic origin. Reich's critics contended that those movements were nothing but the well-known molecular, so-called Brownian movements. But whoever has seen vesicular movements under a microscope and had the occasion to compare them with Brownian vesicular movements will hardly have any difficulty in seeing that the Brownian are angular and mechanical, while the vesicular are softer and organic. Some of the vesicles from inorganic material would also organize the same way as those from organic material. Those energy vesicles, whatever their origin, Reich termed bions, and as they organized into cells or protozoa, he had made an important step towards explaining and demonstrating the phenomenon of biogenesis. The first publication of these results was made in the book Die Bione, Sexpol Verlag, Oslo, 1938. During his work on the bions, Reich came to think that the cancer cells might have an origin similar to that of the protozoa into which some of the bions would organize. Most of those bions had their origin in disintegrated organic tissue, and they would organize into different kinds of protozoa. Now Reich hit upon the idea that cancer cells also might originate from bionously disintegrated organic tissue. A fact that might give some likelihood to this idea is that free cancer cells, such as those in the vaginal secretion, for instance, have forms and movements which may recall those of protozoa, e.g. of amoeba. Another fact pointing in the same direction is that cancer most often starts in such parts of the body which character analysis and vegetotherapy had shown to be most frequently cut off from the regular energy metabolism of the body by cramps and tensions. A third fact supporting the idea is that cancer cells show a reduced oxygen consumption, and cells cut off from the free energy metabolism can no longer get the necessary amount of oxygen to maintain a normal life functioning. By studying sarcoma under the microscope, Reich found that it contained a number of tiny bacilli, which he termed T bacilli, and which elsewhere he had found only when blood corpuscles disintegrated under the microscope. This latter discovery was made in 1937 in Oslo. Chapter 4. Discovery of the Life Energy, Orgone. In 1939, while still in Oslo and working with the bions, Reich accidentally discovered that some of the bions emitted a kind of energy that seemed not to obey the laws of any of the known forms of energy. As we know, Reich had always been occupied with the problem of the energy behind the different life manifestations, and now he thought he had hit upon a special life energy. He made several experiments and observations to find out whether other living organisms emitted the same kind of energy as he had discovered in the bions, and found this to be the case. When it came to human beings, he found that the energy emitted would vary with the degree of free natural liveliness, or with greater or lesser freedom from neurotic inhibitions. The energy thus discovered, Reich termed the life energy, or orgone, from orgasm and organism. As Reich's name for this energy shows, he thought at first that it was limited to living organisms, though it could be shown to influence lifeless matter too. In 1940, the year after he came to America, Reich discovered the same kind of energy in the atmosphere as well, and later he arrived at the conclusion that this energy was ubiquitous, and that one of its manifestations is that which the physicists have called cosmic radiation. The existence of this energy can be demonstrated visually, thermically, and microscopically. Reich's writings contain ample references to experiments of verification, e.g., the cancer biopathy. That an American decree of injunction in March 1954 declared its non-existence does nothing to alter the facts.
How do you feel after listening to these chapters from the book? What do you think? What amazes me every time I read this book are Reich's astute observations and amazing thought process that allow him to discover so much and at such a rapid pace. I'm also impressed with Dr. Raknes' clarity in conveying Reich's work in a simple way, and the responsibility he shows in not sensationalizing it, nor retreating from the gravity and importance of it all. The best way to help the ACO spread its knowledge is by letting others know about us. I hope you share this podcast with your friends and family and let them know about our work. You can connect with us at orgonomic.org. I'm Dr. Chris Burrett. Thank you for listening to the A Different Kind of Psychiatry podcast brought to you by the ACO. Since 1968, the psychiatrists affiliated with the American College of Orgonomy have been helping patients discover greater satisfaction, health, and overall well-being in their lives. Whether patients suffer with mental illness, struggle with addiction, or feel unsatisfied with their work lives or relationships, medical orgone therapy, as practiced by the physicians at the ACO, offers a way forward, often without the use of medication.